In the summer of 2018, my friends Brian, Alyssa, and I decided to escape to the mountains for a change of scenery. The monotony of city life had taken its toll, and we were desperate for a break. We found a listing for a remote cabin near a fire lookout tower. It was cheap, clean, and isolated. It sounded perfect. As we packed, Alyssa joked about bringing her stash of mushrooms to make the trip more interesting. But as soon as we hit the road, a heavy sense of unease gripped me. I insisted we leave the mushrooms untouched, much to Alyssa's frustration. The tension was palpable, but something in my gut told me it wasn't the time for risks. The cabin was as described, secluded, surrounded by dense forest and eerily quiet. The driveway was a narrow dirt road flanked by towering trees, their branches forming an almost oppressive canopy overhead. When we finally arrived, we were struck by how isolated it truly was. The silence felt alive, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. We unloaded our things and settled in, building a small fire outside to enjoy the cool evening air. The warmth of the flames seemed to push back the creeping unease, and for a while we felt at ease. Around dusk, a small group of teens arrived, climbed the nearby fire tower, and waved at us before leaving. Their brief visit reassured us, a reminder we weren't completely alone in the wilderness. As night fell, the atmosphere changed. The oppressive quiet returned, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. Every sound felt amplified in the stillness, each one setting our nerves on edge. To lighten the mood, we opened a few wine coolers and played board games by the fire. Laughter replaced our unease, if only for a while. Then came the knock, 3 deliberate slaps on the window. We froze. The sound was too calculated to be an animal. Alyssa gasped, and Brian's eyes darted to the window. The light from our fire cast flickering shadows across the glass, but nothing was there. Slowly, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911, placing it on speaker as he handed Alyssa a fire poker and me the phone. The operator's calm voice was a thin lifeline in the growing tension. She assured us help was on the way, but every second dragged like an eternity. The silence outside grew suffocating. We huddled together, straining to hear any further sounds. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours until the distant sound of approaching sirens broke the spell. The police arrived in force, bringing search dogs that fanned out into the surrounding woods. Despite their thorough search, they found no trace of anyone. Before leaving, one of the officers mentioned seeing a car parked at the base of the hill leading to our cabin. A chill ran down my spine. As we packed up to leave, the night took another sinister turn. Alyssa's car was covered in dusty handprints, prints that didn't match ours. They were smeared across the windows and doors, as though someone had been circling the car, touching it methodically. Panic overtook us. We threw our belongings into the car haphazardly, desperate to leave. The drive back down the narrow, winding road felt like a gauntlet. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every bump in the road a reminder of how far we were from safety. By the time we reached the nearest town, the sun was just beginning to rise, its light doing little to dispel the lingering fear. To this day, I wonder what could have happened if Brian hadn't called for help. Who had been outside our cabin that night, and what were their intentions? The memory of those handprints, their sinister implication, still haunts me. One summer evening, my friend Kara, her cousin Dylan, and I decided to go fishing near a cabin in Oregon. The trail to the lake was lively during the day, but transformed into a shadowy labyrinth at night. Kara's family had spent countless summers here, but something about this evening felt off. We arrived at the lake just as the sun began to set, its orange and pink hues reflecting off the water. It was eerily quiet, with only the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the stillness. After setting up our fishing gear, Dylan began recounting an old local legend about a group of reclusive mountain dwellers from the 1960s. According to him, They were part of a sinister cult responsible for a string of disappearances in the area. He claimed their spirits still haunted the woods. I laughed it off, but his story left a lingering unease. As the last light of day faded, we decided to pack up and head back. The trail, once lively, now felt menacing. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift, playing tricks on our eyes. Dylan suddenly stopped and whispered, "Do you see that?" Kara and I squinted into the darkness, but it took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Then I saw it, a large figure silhouetted against the trees, slowly staggering toward us. "Run!" Dylan hissed. Terror gripped us as we bolted up the steep hill toward the cabin. The incline was brutal, and my legs burned with each step, but fear pushed me forward. At one point, I dared to glance back and saw the figure moving faster, its clumsy steps turning into an almost predatory gait. My heart pounded as we finally crested the hill and reached the cabin. Once inside, we knocked the family's secret rhythm on the door until Kara's uncle let us in. We barely had time to explain before locking the doors and windows. Hours later, as Kara and I tried to calm down in the downstairs bedroom, we heard it. The same distinctive knock, but this time on the window. We froze. Someone was outside, mimicking the rhythm perfectly. The knock came again, louder and more insistent. Her uncle grabbed a flashlight and called the police, who arrived within 30 minutes. Though they searched the property, no one was found. The precision of the knock still haunts me. It wasn't random. Someone had been watching us closely, studying us in a way that sent chills down my spine. My friend Laura invited me to a birthday party at a remote cabin, hosted by her private school friend, Rachel. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the moonlight. From the moment we arrived, the air felt heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. The party started off awkwardly, a strange mix of social cliques and underlying tension. Laura reassured me it would be fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Around 10 p.m., a group of uninvited guests arrived. They were loud and brash, clearly drunk. Rachel and her friends tried to get them to leave, but they refused, claiming they were friends of a friend. The tension grew as the uninvited group began to stir trouble. They made snide comments, knocked over drinks, and even attempted to commandeer the music. Rachel, visibly irritated, decided to concoct a story about a park ranger coming to check on the cabin. She hoped the mention of authority would make them leave. Surprisingly, it worked, or so we thought. About 20 minutes later, one of the girls from the group returned. She loudly wished Rachel a happy birthday in an exaggerated tone, drawing everyone's attention. Her tone was mocking, almost malicious. Then came the sound of shattering glass from one of the back rooms. Chaos erupted. People screamed, unsure whether to stay or run. I stayed close to Laura, who was trembling. A few brave souls ventured outside to investigate, but they returned pale and trembling. One whispered that he saw shadows moving in the woods, but he couldn't make out what or who it was. The fear in his voice made my blood run cold. The tension peaked when we heard loud banging on the front door, followed by muffled voices outside. Someone whispered that one of the uninvited guests had a weapon. Fear paralyzed the group. Rachel decided to call her parents, who lived nearby, for help. While we waited, the banging intensified, accompanied by occasional laughter from outside. It was mocking, taunting us. When Rachel's parents arrived, they brought flashlights and managed to disperse the group outside. The relief was palpable, but the night wasn't over. As we began to clean up, someone noticed strange markings on the back door. Symbols etched into the wood that hadn't been there before. They looked crude and ominous, like something out of a horror movie. Rachel's parents stayed the night to ensure everyone's safety, but none of us slept well. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, felt like a potential threat. By morning, most of the party-goers had left, including Laura and me. but the lingering sense of unease stayed with me for weeks. Who had etched those symbols, and what were their intentions? The memory of that night still gives me chills. When I was 10, my family took a rare vacation to a lakeside cabin. My sisters, Claire and Lily, and I were thrilled. The cabin had a cozy loft where we played board games, and our parents seemed unusually relaxed. But the peaceful facade didn't last. The first night, I woke to Lily clutching my arm. "Someone's outside," she whispered. Through the window, I saw a pale figure retreating into the darkness. It moved unnaturally, almost as if it were gliding rather than walking. Too frightened to investigate, we ran to our parents, who dismissed it as a bad dream. The next day, we explored the lake. The water was clear and still, reflecting the towering pine trees surrounding it. We spent the day skipping stones and hiking the nearby trails. As the sun began to set, casting an amber glow across the lake, we headed back to the cabin. My dad had us stop just short of the driveway. He pointed to the front door, which was ajar. A chill ran down my spine. "Stay here," he ordered. He grabbed a flashlight and went inside while we waited anxiously outside. Minutes later, he returned, his face pale but composed. "It's fine," he said, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. That night, he double-checked all the locks before we went to bed. Around midnight, I woke to a soft creaking noise. I held my breath, straining to hear. Max, our dog, growled low in his throat from his spot at the foot of my bed. I turned to look at the window and froze. A pale face was pressed against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. It was the same figure from the night before. I couldn't scream. My throat felt paralyzed. Instead, I grabbed Lily and bolted out of the room, Max barking furiously behind us. My parents met us in the hallway, my dad clutching a baseball bat. He led us all into the master bedroom, locking the door behind us. For hours, we sat in silence, listening to the occasional creak of the floorboards and scratching at the back door. The next morning, my dad insisted we leave immediately. As we packed, I noticed strange marks near the window, smudges, as if someone had been pressing their hands and face against the glass. On the drive home, my dad finally confessed. The previous night, he had found the back door unlocked and muddy footprints leading from the woods to the cabin. Whoever had been outside wasn't just watching us, they had been inside. Years later, I still think about that trip. The image of the pale figure at the window is burned into my memory. To this day, I don't know what they wanted or what would have happened if Max hadn't growled and scared them away. The thought chills me to my core. When I was 16, my best friend Sarah and I decided to spend Halloween night at her grandparents' old farmhouse on Birch Road. The house, a creaky two-story relic surrounded by dense woods, had always been a point of fascination in the small town where Sarah's family lived. It was rumored to be haunted, and locals often spoke of strange lights and sounds coming from the property after dark. Sarah's grandparents had passed away years before, and the house had been abandoned ever since. She convinced me it would be fun to explore it, and with the boldness only teenagers possess, we decided to stay overnight. Armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and a bag of snacks, we set out just before sunset. The house was exactly as eerie as I had imagined. Its peeling paint and broken shutters gave it a skeletal appearance, and the overgrown yard seemed to reach out to us as we approached. Sarah unlocked the rusted front door with a key she'd taken from her parents, and the hinges groaned loudly as we stepped inside. The interior was even more unsettling. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. We explored cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. Each creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. She joked about the so-called haunting, laughing at the idea of ghosts. As night fell, we set up our sleeping bags in the living room, the only space that felt somewhat safe. We lit a few candles and tried to distract ourselves by playing cards. But the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside. "Probably just the wind," Sarah said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Around midnight, things took a turn. We heard a loud thud upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. Sarah and I froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "It's probably just an animal," she whispered, but neither of us moved. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. They creaked across the floor above us, pausing directly over where we sat. My chest tightened as I strained to listen. The footsteps started again, this time descending the stairs. Each creak of the old wood felt like a hammer strike to my heart. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to leave," she whispered, but neither of us could move. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs, and the air grew colder, as if all the warmth had been sucked from the room. Then the candles went out, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could switch it on, a voice whispered from the shadows, "Why are you here?" I've never felt fear like that in my life. The voice was low and raspy, filled with malice. Sarah let out a strangled scream, and that broke our paralysis. We grabbed our bags and bolted for the door, not caring about leaving anything behind. As we ran through the yard, I glanced back and saw a figure standing in the window, its face obscured, but its eyes, two glowing orbs, burned into my memory. We didn't stop running until we reached Sarah's car. She fumbled with the keys, and I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced the figure would follow us. When the engine roared to life, we sped away, not saying a word until we were back at her house. Sarah's parents were furious when they found out where we'd been, but nothing they said could erase what we experienced. To this day, we don't talk about that night. The farmhouse was torn down a few years later, but I still think about the voice, the figure, and those glowing eyes. Whatever was in that house didn't want us there, and it made sure we never came back.